Let's set the stage by recognizing that over the coming decades, and certainly by the end of this century, we need to have deeply decarbonized our energy system. And really that means zero emissions, or even better, negative emissions. And Arun, you have your list of technologies, your top 10, and you highlighted one example, but what I'd like you to do is to think about in the near term, the midterm, and then in the long term, what are the most critical technologies and why, and how should the government be thinking about supporting these, given that they span the time scale from immediate to a long time from now?
So let me can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I think if you look at the global context, and including the United States, I know that we have found a lot of natural gas, which is terrific. It is decarbonizing our electricity system. But we are still using coal, which is a huge source of at least 25% of our electricity. We need to decarbonize that urgently. And that's carbon capture. I think there will be at some point a price on carbon. I just can't predict exactly when. I don't think anyone can. And when that price of carbon hits, this will be you will need for technology. So I think it's very important to bring down the cost of carbon capture. Today it's about $60, $70 a ton for post-combustion capture. If you could bring it down to below $30 a ton, then there's a lot of markets that open up as well. So that is clearly one. I think energy efficiency, Secretary Schultz mentioned, absolutely critical. And this is in our buildings, in our manufacturing supply chains, in our transportation. I think it's extremely critical that we pay a lot of attention, not just to the technology, but the behavior, as was mentioned, and Jim is working on that, but also on the regulatory reform involved in this. So I think that, and the financing, energy efficiency, if you don't have the financing up front, it's extremely difficult to actually enable that. In the long term, and there are many others, we love to get nuclear energy, but that has to be cost competitive, and that requires some regulatory reform as well, and some technologies to come in. I think the long term, if you really are trying to look at negative emissions, we have to look at things like how do we do agriculture the right way, land use, as well as if you could somehow figure out how to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turn that into hydrocarbons or some kind of storage at $2 a gallon, that would completely change the ballgame. And we don't know how to do that because it's too expensive to do that. It's not that we can't do it. It's just that it's too expensive. It's not viable. And those are the kinds of things that I would look at. Looking at biology, by the way, we are in the golden age of biology, and we are using it for health. If we could, so what does it relate to this? I mean, if you look at photosynthesis, which is where all our food comes from, even if you're not a vegetarian, your food comes from photosynthesis. It is one of the most inefficient processes out there. If you go from sunlight to a chemical bond, it's less than 1% efficient. Just a little bit of increase, and we had funded this from RPE, a little bit of increase in efficiency on the Kelvin-Benson cycle can change not only the ballgame for biomass use for energy, but also for food, which is going to be absolutely critical in the future. So I don't want to take up too much time, but there's a lot.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more. I know you've done a lot of work on the electric grid, and can you say something about the importance of the transformation of our electric grid, and again, what is an appropriate government R&D role in that transformation?
So just to give a shameless publicity, Sally and I just wrote an article, which is on the Precourt Institute on decarbonizing the electricity grid. So if you step back, the grid was started, at least the architecture of the grid, has not changed for the last 120 years. The architecture. This is the Tesla Edison architecture. And the paradigm is you got centralized generation, long-distance transmission, medium voltage distribution into our homes. And the generation always follows the load. And it flows one way. This paradigm is going to change, because it was never meant for 50% renewables integration where there are all kind of transients in the generation part. It was never meant for that. It was never meant for distributed electricity from the edges of the grid feeding back. It was never meant for that. And all our institutions, whether it's the ISOs, the grid operators, the utilities, the regulatory system, the business model, the financial system, is all based on paradigm. So when the paradigm is changing, everything shifts. And so I think there's a role that we have to play in the R&D as well as the regulatory framework and the business models and the financing to see how can we transition is the most cost-effective way into where, let's say, California is trying to go 50% renewable by 2030. That's not easy. And this is not just in California, this is going to go around the world. And so I think there's a huge amount for the university as a non-financial stakeholder to bring not only do the R&D, but bring the communities on, for example, both sides of the meter together to really enable this to happen.
Okay, terrific. So let's turn our attention to the Breakthrough Energy Coalition. So, of course, all of us in the research community and concerned citizens about climate change, we're delighted to hear about this. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and in particular, how will the Breakthrough Energy Coalition think about its investments? You know, what are those areas? So Arun had his top 10 list. So what do you think are the most important things to invest in, and what time frame, you know, is this short, medium, long term? How is the Breakthrough Energy Coalition thinking about that? And then, again, thinking about the government, what would be a government partnership or role in the carrying out that program?
Great. Let me actually just start off with the electric grid as an example. And thinking about that, we have trillions of dollars of capital in the world that we ascribe to what we call either sovereign wealth funds or pension funds or endowments. And a typical thing that has been popular over the last decade or 20 years is investing in infrastructure. These are highly regulated assets. They have cash flows that provide an income stream. They have an inflation hedge in them. And they tend to do better than just bonds, and with some equity upside that comes from capital expenditures that you invest into the upkeep and maintenance and improving the state of this infrastructure. In fact, if you're an individual and you're retiring, those are exactly the characteristics you're looking for after you retire that you want to have in your income stream to manage your retirement income needs. So this has become fashionable. For the last 20 years, there are many pension plans and sovereign funds around the world that do this day in and day out. In fact, there's now too much supply of capital into infrastructure too much supply of capital, so the demand is very high, but the supply of assets is very limited. So these assets are highly bid up and very competitive in an auction. So when I was in Alberta, this was exactly what we were looking to invest in, was infrastructure. But the question we asked was the question that both of you might have addressed in your paper. You just can't keep buying this kind of infrastructure. That is, the centralized grid transmission type of infrastructure. So when you think about energy, distributed energy is going to have a place in this world. And so we started thinking about what is the new kind of infrastructure that long-term investors who are patient and have that 20, 30, 40-year time horizon that matches the liabilities that we have obligations to pay out. And so that really was the intellectual curiosity that led me personally to start looking for new kinds of infrastructure. And as I looked for that, I ended up discovering distributed energy as an attractive area to make investments in. But the challenge you have is there's not enough of this distributed energy beyond wind and solar today that has enough of an operating history that gives you the comfort to make that investment like you do in a traditional sense today. So when you start looking for these new opportunities, you realize you have to move beyond just infrastructure to innovation. You have to get comfortable taking technology risk. You can buy a wind turbine today, but Vestas has an operating history for a very long time. You cannot find that with new kinds of innovative, disruptive energy sources. So then we started moving into the world of investing in innovation. And the intention there was we'll put a little bit of money to work in a company that's innovative and disruptive. We'll get to understand the business, and at some point, this company is going to mature to the point where it's going to require that large scale of capital, and we are best suited. And in fact, we would have an informational advantage if we were investing in the innovation ourselves. That was my experience prior to coming here. When I got to California, and I had to address the broader question of how do you reinvest in energy and the evolution of that energy mix in the portfolio of a long-term investor. One thing was pretty clear to me. There were going to be good opportunities for scaling up technologies where the risk and return profile matched that of a long-term institutional investor. You could be an endowment or a pension plan. In fact, let me state for all of you, a fact of life is that endowments across this country in their real assets portfolio tend to have oil and gas exploration and production. Not hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars worth of it. That's got to potentially change. You cannot keep investing in that if we think we're going to be in a cleaner energy future. So then the question became, okay, how do you fund the innovative side of it? And I could tell you, and you would all acknowledge that there are more scars than there are success stories because of many of the things that Arun's talked about. The business models had a lot of hubris attached to them. The lack of partnerships because the VCs thought that they could do this on their own, and they didn't need the bigger corporations to partner with. And frankly, government instability in the application of the support that's required to enable these companies to succeed. And the onerous terms that governments would put on even the most primitive type of loan structures that needed to help these companies succeed. When you add all those things together, the last 10 to 20 years have clearly been a great lesson for a lot of people. That does not mean you stop investing in clean energy. Now, what do we do going forward? I'm at the University of California. It's a very public university. I don't have the luxury of being in a private entity. The decisions I make are going to get the scrutiny of the public. But I do feel strongly that investing in innovation can be profitable. This is our thinking until one day, we got a phone call from Bill Gates. And Bill Gates said, I've got 27 of my friends together with myself. And we're going to go after this. We're going to go big, and we're going to make this happen. There was no need to sell me on this. I had 7 years of thinking through this problem. And my only question to Bill Gates was, how can we help you? We have 10 campuses across the state. We have 3 Department of Energy national labs. We have 5 medical centers. We spend close to $1 to $2 billion a year annually on energy, traditional energy, to maintain a $26 billion enterprise with 300,000 staff and 250,000 students. And we have $100 billion of capital, of which I've committed $1 billion. You just tell me how we can help you. And so that led to Bill Gates saying, we'd like you to be part of this ecosystem that we're creating. It's called the Breakthrough Energy Coalition. And we don't want you to bring capital, because we've got lots of that. We want you to bring everything else you just described. Because if you're going to be an LP or a limited partner in this partnership, you better be a valuable limited partnership. So what's the Breakthrough Energy Coalition? Because that's the fundamental question you asked me. It's 27 individuals and the University of California today, but that's going to grow. That just happened to be the effort for 4 to 6 months of getting the ball rolling. Number one. Number two, it's of course trying to get 20 countries to double their R&D budget. But I think if you can put 27 LPs with a good capital base of a couple of $1 billion together, beyond just capital, they bring a lot of value added. The one thing I said to Bill Gates is that we can definitely help with the scale-up capital, because that's something I feel most comfortable with. And in fact, I feel most confident that we can get our peers around the world. It could be the Kuwaitis or the folks from the Abu Dhabi region or other parts of the world in Australia and New Zealand, where there's an abundance of pension capital or sovereign capital, and they completely understand how to invest in infrastructure. You don't have to give them a pitch on clean energy. You just have to say it's the next generation of infrastructure for the world. So we can bring that capital as well together for the scaling up. So the Breakthrough Energy Coalition is going to focus on a couple of $1 billion of investments in what I would call 100 to 200 breakthrough ideas. And the intent there is that a couple of these breakthrough ideas, someone asked me yesterday, I was at a forum with Arun, it was at the Tesla factory, and the question was, if you could run a magic wand, what would the next decade look like? And I said, I hope the next decade's got 10 Teslas, not one Tesla, that we can be proud of. And I hope that the Breakthrough Energy Partnership is going to be learning from all the lessons of the past and try very hard to put in place something that is much better, with the hope of trying to create the reality and the vision that everybody's going to talk about today and for the next president. So it's a work in progress. Everybody asks us, are you ready to go? The answer is no. We're taking the time to figure out how this needs to work. This is a long-term problem. This is a 20-year thing. Our intention is not to have an exit 3 years from now and an IPO or 6 years from now. We have to be patient, and that's where I think long-term capital, like the University of California and other universities and endowments in this country, are ideally suited, because our horizon is not impatient. And that's, I think, what it's going to take to create a cleaner and a better energy future in terms of real companies that will be part of the economy.
Okay, well, terrific. Thank you. That sets up nicely, I think, the next topic. So Secretary Schultz, talked about 1973 and the first energy crisis. And at that time, there was an enormous investment in energy and clean energy and energy that would made us independent from having to rely on importing energy from other countries. And by some measures, it was wildly successful. We wouldn't have photovoltaic panels that are, inexpensive today. We wouldn't have all the wind turbines that have made massive amounts of wind energy available. So it was wildly successful, but that was 1973, and now it's 2016. And in some ways, we don't have the luxury of time. Yes, we have to be patient, but at the same time, this is an urgent issue. And I wonder if either or both of you could make some remarks about what do we need to do differently today in this next round of investment in energy R&D that allows us to get there much more quickly?
That's a great question. I don't know, I had this very discussion with Steve Chu. Is he around? Steve, are you here? Well, he and I had this discussion yesterday at the Tesla factory meeting. So let's look at how do we accelerate innovation and actually going down that learning curve much faster than what can be done today. And if you look at the historical context of what has gone faster and what has gone slowly, you find that we unbelievably gone faster in, for example, solar panels. We never could have expected the cost to come down so quickly, the efficiencies to go up that quickly. And the question is, why is it so? On the other hand, if you go back in history, the learning curve for nuclear was going the opposite way. The more we did, the more expensive it became, which is the wrong trend. So what is it that makes it go faster this way? And it is about iteration in the system. If you make small modular systems and get it in front of the customers and get it in front and deploy it, you can then learn from it and actually make it, and you can iterate faster so you can innovate faster. It does not happen if you build a behemoth plant and that's the only one of its kind. And I think when you take that lesson and look at how our energy system is constructed today, let's say the chemical industry or petrochemical industry, they have huge plants today, right? And those were built 30, 40 years ago. And they're still look at our coal-fired power plants. And one has to think carefully, now that natural gas has come back and a lot of chemical industry coming back, is that the way we want to go? Or do you want to build small modular systems, not just in nuclear, but many other areas, so you can iterate faster? And I think it's one of the biggest challenges, both on a technology point of view as well as in the engineering, the system design, is how do we get economies of scale in modular systems? And typically people think that modular system, you don't get economy of scale. That's a real issue that we should be focusing on. And all of these technologies that I was talking about can, you could look at them and say that which ones are modular, which ones are not, and if they're not modular, how do we make them modular and iterate faster?
Okay, terrific. So would you like to answer, give any remarks on that, or I've got another question for you?
Let me try a very simple one in response to that. I firmly believe that when you try to solve this type of problem for the world, it's so complicated. And I think one of the lessons, as I've dissected through the last 10 years, is everyone sort of acted alone in trying to solve their own problem and make things successful. The key is collaboration. I think this kind of a technological solution or innovative solution or creating a new future truly requires collaborative efforts. And I think that's where, I'd say if you're the president and you're the White House, there's a lot of practicalities of what it takes to get things done, but the convening power of the White House is absolutely phenomenal. It's unparalleled. And I think recognizing that you can solve a global problem with that convening power, you can make a huge impact. And we've seen it. This president, this secretary, in the last year, there have been a number of things that have gone on at the White House where they have brought together philanthropists, they have brought together institutional investors, they have brought together other governments. I think these are excellent examples of what it can take to get things done. So whilst we can argue about they're not doing this or they're not doing that, I think let's focus on the positive, which is that convening power and trying to collaborate at a global scale to deal with a very complex global problem. So that's really the only thing I can add to it.
Let me just double down on that, because I think I completely agree. The convening power, the convening authority uses very little taxpayer dollars, but the impact of that is enormous for the taxpayer dollars, whatever little is used. And I think the bully pulpit of the president is a huge one, and we need to leverage that as much as possible.
Okay, we only have about 3 minutes left, if I'm correct. So the final question to you. So Governor Granholm made the case that if we want to encourage the U.S. to rapidly adapt to pursue these things, that we need to make the case that this is going to create jobs, U.S. jobs. And if we look historically at the U.S. investment in R&D, many of the things that we've invented here end up creating a lot of manufacturing jobs overseas. So if we think particularly about mission innovation, which the goal is to double the investment in R&D, if you couple that to a jobs agenda, how can we do this next version of R&D, energy R&D, to make U.S. jobs? What do we need to do differently?
Well, let's step back for a moment and ask the question that, let's say you were to do wind farms, for example, and ask how can we create jobs out here? One has to recognize that these are, when things are made, manufactured, or even deployed, these are global supply chains. This happens in the private sector. The government doesn't make things. It enables the private sector to make things. To recognizing that global supply chain, then you ask the question, can we capture the value in that value chain out here, including part of being is the jobs part. I would love to see, what Governor Granholm mentioned about, this state and that state, I think that's terrific. I would love to see the federal government have the states compete. I think competition is a good thing. And have them compete, and if they have the natural resources or the ecosystem of universities or other organizations, I think they will then, they will come out in front and let then the private sector run through this in private-public partnerships, exactly what Jagdeep was talking about. Let the collaborations happen in a self-assembled way, in a bottom-up way, and let them compete for any federal dollars, if there is, for looking at these kinds of ecosystems.
Okay, your thoughts?
My thoughts. Okay, well, there are a lot of experts on jobs here, so I'm not going to touch that part. But related to jobs is the fact that I convened all our national labs at the UC system for a day in my office to learn about what could I do to help them with respect to funding innovation and commercialization of technology coming out? What shocked me is at the end of the day, what they reminded me of is the future recruitment of their own research scientists was dependent on the fact that they needed to change their culture to become more innovative and recognize that if they didn't show this next generation of leaders or scientists in this country that they were a lab that actually could take idea to reality and actually had a pathway and partnerships, it would limit their ability to attract the next best talent. And so we left thinking, whatever we do, if you're a leader today in any one of our UC organizations, we gotta move towards a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship and a pathway and a partnership between the ideas into reality. And frankly, as I try to hire people in my office, the new millennials, they'd rather come work for people and organizations that actually think about sustainability, not just as a brochure, but inculcate it into the culture of the organization. So I think, if this is a cultural change that's going on in the mind of our younger generation, and that generation is our next generation of leaders, I think you'll see more dramatic change in the way jobs get created and new types of organizations embracing this type of opportunity. So those are my final thoughts.
Okay, all right, well, please let's thank the panelists. Thank you very much.